Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another fascinating topic.
Always excited to explore new ideas, especially when the source material is as intriguing as the one you sent over.
Yeah, that excerpt from The Rise of Nations really got me thinking. Borders, huh? They seem so, I don't know, permanent.
Right. Like they've always been there, these lines on a map defining our world.
But then the book starts talking about how borders haven't always been lines at all. Like in ancient times, they were totally different.
Yeah, that mentions these like fuzzy zones of influence. It's almost hard to picture,
Oh,
right?
totally. So how did we go from these blurry zones to the hard borders we have today?
Well, that's a journey through history, power dynamics, and even how we define what a nation is.
Okay, I'm ready for the journey. Lead the way.
All right, well, imagine a time before maps as we know them.
Okay, so no Google Maps to guide our way.
Exactly. Back then, natural features like mountains, rivers, big landmarks.
Yeah, those kind of served as rough boundaries between groups of people.
Right. But it wasn't about precise lines or claiming every inch of land.
More like, this is generally where our influence ends and yours begins, kind of thing.
Exactly. The Roman Empire is a great example.
Huge empire. So how did they mark their borders?
Well, not with a continuous wall or anything like that. Their control sort of faded the further you got from Rome.
So their borders were more about zones of control that gradually diminished, not sharp lines.
Exactly. It's like a different way of thinking about territory.
Makes sense. So when did this idea of strict borders start to take hold?
Well, the book points to a pivotal moment. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from history class. Didn't it end some big war?
It ended the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict in Europe. But it also did something even more significant.
What's that?
It introduced this idea of Westphalian sovereignty, where rulers had complete control over clearly defined territories.
So it's like they drew lines on the map and said, this is mine, hands off.
Basically. And this idea, it spread globally, became the foundation for the modern nation-state system.
Wow, that's a huge shift. But the book also mentions that this wasn't always a good thing, right?
Sadly, no. Especially during colonization, the idea of fixed borders often led to devastating consequences.
Like what?
Well, a chilling example is the Berlin Conference in 1884.
I've heard of that, but refresh my memory.
A handful of European powers met and essentially carved up the African continent among themselves.
It's like slicing a cake.
Exactly. They drew borders with zero regard for existing communities, cultures, or tribal boundaries.
It's mind-blowing how those arbitrarily drawn lines led to so many problems.
Right. Conflicts, forced migrations, ethnic tensions, many issues we still see today.
So borders, they went from fuzzy to fixed, and they carry a lot of baggage.
That's putting it mildly. But they do more than just separate land. They shape identities too.
Yeah, that's a good point. So
Yeah.
they tell you who in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't.
Exactly. Think about the Great Wall of China.
Okay, so a massive wall, obviously meant to keep invaders out.
Yes, but also to define what it meant to be Chinese, to separate us from them.
Right, it's not just a physical barrier, it's a symbol.
Powerful symbol. Like the Berlin Wall during the Cold War, a concrete representation of an ideological divide.
Wow, I hadn't thought of it like that.
Or consider the U.S.-Mexico border, a place where a developed and a developing economy clash.
Lots of movement across that border, right? People, goods, money.
But also huge disparities in opportunity and living standards. It's incredibly complex.
So borders can reflect inequalities and even exacerbate them.
It's a difficult question, and it highlights how borders can be so multifaceted.
Meaning they can have both positive and negative impacts.
Exactly. The book gives the example of France during the Revolution. The idea of a unified nation within its borders helped rally people to a common cause.
So in that case, the border helped forge a national identity, bringing people together.
Precisely. It wasn't just about separation, it was about unity.
This is fascinating. We've gone from fuzzy zones to powerful lines, shaping identities and even nations.
And as we'll see, this complexity is often at the heart of why borders can backfire, leading to conflict and human suffering. It's kind of wild though, right? Like we thought maybe with all this technology and globalization, borders would become, less important.
Yeah, like they just fade away as we all become more interconnected.
But it seems like the opposite is happening in some ways. Like the book talks about how climate change is actually putting more pressure on borders.
Oh, yeah, like how rising sea levels are literally redrawing coastlines.
Exactly. And think about all those island nations like the Maldives. They could just vanish.
It's terrifying to think about people being forced from their homes because the map is changing.
And then there's climate-induced migration on top of that.
Yeah, people fleeing droughts and floods and extreme weather. It's putting a huge strain on border systems.
He's creating all these new ethical dilemmas, too.
Like, who has the responsibility to help these climate refugees? How do we balance security with humanitarian aid?
That's tough. Really tough. And then on the technology side, it's almost like the internet was supposed to make physical borders irrelevant.
Right. Ideas can travel around the world instantly. You can work with someone on the other side of the planet.
But then you look at something like China's Great Firewall.
Yeah, where they control what people can access online. It's like a digital border almost.
Exactly. It's
Right.
like we're building new walls, not out of brick and mortar, but out of code.
It raises a lot of questions about freedom and control in the digital age, that's for sure.
And these issues aren't limited to just, authoritarian countries either. We see debates about data privacy and online security in democracies, too.
Absolutely. The book uses the example of the Schengen Zone in Europe,
Ah, yeah, the dream of a borderless Europe.
where you can travel between so many countries without a passport. I mean, I love that freedom.
It was a huge step towards unity, but then the refugee crisis in 2015 happened.
Yeah, and a lot of those Schengen borders slammed shut.
Countries reimposed border checks, and we saw this surge in nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment.
It showed just how fragile that idea of a borderless world can be.
It did. So maybe, a world without borders is just a fantasy.
But the book doesn't end on a totally pessimistic note, right? It talks about how borders are changing and evolving.
Right. They're not going away anytime soon, but they are adapting to these new global realities.
So what's next for borders? What are some of the ways they're changing? I'm curious.
Well, the book suggests they're becoming more fluid and multifaceted,
Yeah.
less about lines on a map and more about regulating flows.
Flows of people, goods, information.
Exactly. It's about managing risk and opportunity in this interconnected world.
That makes sense. So what does this mean for the future? The book highlights a couple of interesting trends. One is the rise of nationalism,
Yeah, with Brexit being a prime example.
where concerns about globalization and a desire for more national control led to, a country leaving a union.
And it seems like that sentiment is growing in other parts of the world, too.
Like, people are looking for a sense of belonging and control amidst all this global change and uncertainty.
It's definitely a powerful force. And it's not just a Western phenomenon either. The book also mentions how nationalism is on the rise in other parts of the world, like Asia and Africa.
And the motivations are often similar, right? Economic anxieties, cultural shifts, a sense that globalization hasn't benefited everyone equally.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with deep roots. And then there's China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's a whole other way of looking at borders.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's like redrawing the map, not through conquest, but through infrastructure and trade.
Massive project, connecting China with Asia, Europe, Africa, through roads, railways, ports. It's reshaping global trade in a big way.
It's almost like a new era of empire building, but based on economic interdependence rather than military might. Pretty fascinating.
It is, and it really raises questions about what the future of borders will look like in this increasingly multipolar world.
So many things to think about. And then the book also mentions the potential for new frontiers,
Like the Arctic.
which is opening up as the ice melts due to climate change.
Right. And it's full of untapped resources and strategic importance. Could it become a new international zone governed by shared principles instead of the usual territorial claims? It's a possibility.
Imagine that, a model for cooperation in a region that could easily become a source of conflict.
The key is whether the international community can rise to the occasion, or will we fall back into old patterns of competition? Only time will tell.
And the book also talks about the rise of these supranational organizations,
Like the European Union and the African Union.
where countries are pooling their sovereignty to address shared challenges.
It suggests that maybe in some ways borders are becoming less important, at least in certain contexts.
It's like we're experimenting with new models of governance, trying to find ways to work together across those lines on the map.
Exactly. And that's ultimately what it's all about.
Yeah.
How do we live together on this planet in a way that's peaceful, just, and sustainable? That's the question we need to be asking.
And it seems like the answer to that question is going to involve borders in one way or another. They're not going away, but how we manage them, how we think about them, that's what's going to shape our future. It's amazing how much ground we've covered on borders. From like ancient times to today, it's quite a journey.
It is. And the excerpt you sent over really gets you thinking about the impact these lines have had and continue to have on all of us.
Absolutely. So looking back at all we've discussed, What would you say are the biggest takeaways for our listener?
Well, first and foremost, borders are not just lines on a map.
Right, there's so much more than that. We've seen how they can be sources of conflict, but also how they can bring people together.
They shape identities, economies, they reflect power dynamics.
Yeah.
It's really complex.
Yeah, and they're constantly evolving, too.
Exactly. They're not static. They're always being contested, renegotiated, redefined.
And the book ends on a really thought-provoking note. It talks about how borders are simultaneously the source of humanity's greatest conflicts and its greatest opportunities.
Such a powerful statement, right?
Totally. What do you make of that?
I think it perfectly captures that duality.
Yeah.
On one hand, borders divide us, create barriers, fuel conflict. But on the other hand,
They can provide a framework for cooperation, for managing shared resources, for protecting human rights.
exactly. And for tackling those big global challenges like climate change and pandemics, it's all about how we choose to use them.
It really makes you think, what if we could redraw the map? What would a more just and sustainable world look like?
It's a fascinating thought experiment. Maybe you can explore that further, research some border disputes, see how things have been resolved or not resolved in different parts of the world.
Ooh, I like that. And maybe even imagine what the future holds for borders as our world becomes more interconnected.
Absolutely. The future of borders is not set in stone. It's something we're actively shaping through our actions and choices.
That's a powerful reminder. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of borders, what's the one thing you'd like our listener to walk away with?
I'd say this. If borders are both a source of conflict and opportunity, what kind of world do WE want to build with them? Or maybe even without them? It's a question worth pondering.
It is. It's a question for all of us. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating and often challenging world of borders. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives going.